In this part of the video series, Dr. Malhotra will cover the progress, gaps, and challenges in child marriage research on prevalence and measurement, and determinants, correlates, and context. She will also offer several recommendations for research on child marriage drivers going forward.
So there's been huge progress on the prevalence and measurement literature. We have much more data on many more countries, more regions. We focus more on the rates and are very precise about it. And we look at the burden in trends. We also have now, we noticed in the literature, a robust and standardized measure. Women marry 20 through 24 before age 18. And that is being used much more as a standard measure, whereas previously people were using many different measures of child marriage. And we are starting to have more data on subnational rates and the difference between boys and girls and things like that. And so we're far, far ahead of where we used to be. What are some of the gaps and challenges? Well, we still need more subnational analysis for targeting action. We don't have good data for prevalence in humanitarian settings. Everybody thinks that rates are high in humanitarian settings, but that's not necessarily true, and it's not necessarily easy to measure because it's hard to go and collect data in those settings. We need to standardize how we measure trends. Different agencies measure trends over time using cohort data versus different cross-sectional data. And unfortunately, I worry a little bit about many modeling exercises that are out there that are based on assumptions that are not clarified. So for example, recently UNICEF published a report saying 30 million more girls could be married as children because of COVID. And on the one hand, we do need people to know the dangers of COVID for child marriage. There's no question about that. On the other hand, it's important to clarify that this is based on certain assumptions, a certain modeling exercise, which in this case, for example, is almost entirely due to the fact that we think that girls being kept out of school is going to accelerate that trend. And as you can see that in the last 5 years alone, there were more studies published than the previous 15. And there's a huge and massive literature, especially on sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, but also in the Middle East and other globally and other geographic regions. So the progress on determinants and correlates has been that there are consistently confirmed correlates pretty much everywhere. Less educated girls from poorer households in rural areas get married early. We have a lot of nuance with primary data and mixed methods. We see over and over again that studies establish the importance of education and the negative relationship between education and child marriage, and especially secondary education. We have many more geographies and subpopulations for which we have data, and we're starting to have data on conflict and crisis, although, as I said, it's not as clear that there's that negative relationship, positive relationship between conflict and child marriage as people always think. It's not always the case. But our biggest challenges are that there's huge redundancy. It's not clear that this many studies needed to be done. A lot of times people keep saying that they want to look at drivers because they want their programs to be very contextually driven and they want to tailor their programs to their context. But what we found was that people are finding, even when people find different drivers, they're doing the same programs. So it's not clear that doing research on drivers is helping people to frame better programs. The other big challenge still seems to be that people are focusing still on the individual and the household and not on the aggregate and social determinants. We're not looking at trends over time in what happens when more girls get educated. We're not looking at trends over times when poverty rates go down. We're looking at which girls in particular households are getting married, which girls are less educated. We're not looking at it as an aggregate. We're also not looking at the normative effects of education. We're looking at only sort of this correlated relationship. We're not looking at what is education doing in terms of how people think of girls. When many girls are getting educated, do people think of girls as children instead of marriageable adults? And that's not well studied. And we also are not studying enough the job opportunities for young women and what that means as role models for younger girls not getting married. So, what are our recommendation on research for drivers going forward? Um, our first conclusion would be we know more than enough in most cases, and we should stop doing more studies just because we think we have a lot more to learn. But instead, we should be pushing the experts who are really good at doing these studies to answer some of the key remaining questions rather than doing broad driver studies. We should consult the rich literature that already exists instead of doing more studies of our own. And we should start looking at the big picture factors rather than the small nuances, because what are the big changes that are happening in districts, states, countries that are associated with big changes in child marriage rates? I think those are the focus needs to shift.